Okay, well, hello, good afternoon, buenas tardes, everybody. Sorry that this review video about the third week's readings is a little bit later than usual, but of course it's the holiday weekend, and I'm sure undoubtedly many of you are kind of pushing things back or waiting until Tuesday or maybe even Wednesday of the fourth week to get caught up with everything. So I guess in a way, El Profesor is in that same category too. But as we get ready to get back get back to work after the long holiday weekend, I definitely want to make sure that this video was indeed ready for you. But yes, in this video, and the timing of the topic, of course, couldn't seem to be any better because of the holiday weekend. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the things in chapters 5 and 6 of the Who Built America text, and also look at some of the points from the PowerPoint programs on the American Revolution and also on the Spanish California. In fact, if anything, in this video, I think I'll focus more on chapter 5 and the two PowerPoint programs, and I'll just say a little bit, not too much in terms of the topics in chapter 6. So to open things up, everybody, what I'll do is let me go ahead and say a few things about the PowerPoint program on the American Revolution. Now, as you've seen by now, of course, it's definitely one of the lengthier ones from the from the class, in which in this program I look at a lot of the military aspects, the military angles going on. Of course, chief among them, of course, George Washington tactics from 1776 all the way to the end. But of course, some of the other people, some of the other continental army figures too, like Nathaniel Greene, and then we had John Paul Jones. And of course a few others, but of course Washington is the focus of the PowerPoint program. But one thing about the American Revolution is that the revolution itself, it didn't really necessitate or predicate the idea of a total victory over the British Army. If anything, after the struggles that Washington had in the summer of 1776, and even though, of course, right now we're at this time, holiday week, we're of course celebrating the great ideals of Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's one thing to express these ideas in paper, but you need to back up these ideas militarily. And unfortunately, Washington really didn't do that in the summer of 1776, with some disastrous effects, particularly during the Battle of Long Island. So up until the latter stage of 1776, if anything, it seemed definitely uncertain that this big noble experiment in a Republican government, in the Republican small r representative democracy, these types of things, it was quite uncertain as to whether these things would actually hold any weight. And some of the delegates of the Continental Congress were, you might say, maybe backpedaling a little bit and hoping to maybe appeal to shall we say, King George's good graces, that is, appeal to his better side. But as we saw in some of the previous readings from last week's, from the readings in chapters 3 and 4, King George, let's put it this way, really had no interest in, shall we say, negotiating or talking to the lowly colonists. Essentially, once George declared war on them, the die was cast. There was essentially no turning back. And Tom Paine's ideas in common sense, for the most part, made it evident that George is a clown, he's a thug, he's a goon, he's a brute. He's Parliament really isn't your problem. It's this fat clown that's on the throne. He's the main source of your troubles, blah blah blah. So, but again, my main point was that by the end of 1776, things were quite uncertain. But it's at this point in time where Washington realizes that in order to secure victory, he doesn't have to achieve it, shall we say, militarily, but politically. And to do that, his objective is not so much to win, but not to lose. Washington realized that by the end of 1776, it was imperative to keep the war going constantly, so that the war would be what you might say, drain the resources of Parliament and drain the will of the British public. So in other words, keep the Continental Army together at all costs. Even if you don't win a lot of big battles, keep your army together. Engage in small retreat, skirmish, throw a few shots. Much like what the Minutemen had doing with Lexington and Concord. Maintain that strategy, that hit and run strategy, for the balance of the Revolution, and that's pretty much essentially what Washington did for the remainder of the Revolution. Now, of course, it was imperative to gain some key victories, to boost the morale of not only the army but of the young fledgling nation, and that, of course, where we hear about the victories, the victories at the Trenton and Princeton, and of course the famous portrait of Washington sailing across the Delaware River. Thomas Paine, of course, who was instrumental, and you might say pushing the cause for independence with common sense. Paine, with his next pamphlet, The American Crisis, definitely helped to build up the morale of the troops in talking about the idea that tyranny, like hell, cannot be easily conquered. It takes guts, it takes effort, it takes fortitude. Washington had his officers read American Crisis to his men, so Paine's words, like what happened earlier in 1776, also echoed toward the end of the year, as his men heard about these words, and Paine, in essence, helped to promote the idea of a greater American ideal, of greater an American cause for the most part. But despite the victories at Trenton and Princeton, for the most part, it was a long hard battle for the rest of the American revolutionary period. You had episodes, of course, like the winter encampment at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. The British, of course, would try other strategies to try to put an end to these this colonial uprising. But as the PowerPoint indicates, we had some generals who engaged in some really, shall we say, incompetent practices. That is, they really couldn't quite get the job done per se. And that, of course, is where you hear about the case of General John Burgoyne and what happened at Saratoga. Toward the end of 1777, and Saratoga, of course, instrumental because that's when the colonists can now turn to France. Benjamin Franklin, for his part, was the as you know the story by now, was you might say the de facto ambassador of the colonies to the Europeans, to the court of King Louis. So once news of Saratoga got back to Franklin, got back to France, King Louis was, shall we say, more than willing to lend a hand, because of course the French were none too happy about what happened with the French and Indian War, with losing their territories. Of course, what we now know as present-day Canada, and of course Louisiana as well. So you might say King Louis was definitely in the mood for some revenge too, and even though the king wisely for his part held back, you didn't know how these colonists, these bumpkins, as he probably would have put it, would have gotten the job done. But Saratoga, you might say, proved to be the winning formula, and from that point in time, that's when the French become involved, with people, of course, like the famous Marquis de Lafayette and the Count Rochambeau and many others too. And these men, of course, very instrumental in helping to promote the colonial cause too. And you had a lot of other Europeans as well, like the Baron von Steuben, the Pole Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was a popular figure, and actually in the Detroit area, especially among the Polish community there. So you have these Europeans who were quite intrigued by this colonial cause, and of course they were no fans of the British, and these men were definitely quite instrumental in helping to promote this wider American cause, these wider American ideals. Okay, let me just quickly scroll through the program a little bit more. Okay, and I want to go and talk, and I want to shift attention to now what's happening in the South. I think one thing about the American Revolution is that maybe it might has a bit of a romantic ideal in that since it happened so close to 4th of July. Maybe not too many people, not too much of the American public realizes that yes, even though it's great to celebrate the words of and wisdom of Thomas Jefferson and that these ideas are definitely powerful. They're definitely palpable and instrumental for the American cause. Maybe a lot of people tend to forget that the American Revolution, in many cases, was a nasty, ugly, brutal war, and nowhere did that happen more so than in the South. The war in the South took on some really ugly, nasty dimensions. Many of the documentaries that networks like PBS and the History Channel have done over the years have really underscored that too. That for the most part, the war took on blood feud, vengeance, really nasty overtones, which one could argue that might have preceded what would happen in the Civil War just within a century, less than a century, down the road after that. And the British, for their part, they recognized that there was a lot of animosity and tensions between the people in the South, between the coastal elites and the backwoods people. The British tried to play up upon that to further their cause, but if anything, the British made things much worse. Washington, for his part, recognized that because of the ugliness and the nastiness going on in the South, his objective was to make the British presence in the South that is less palatable for the people, so that they would turn to the American cause. In other words, make the British seem like the bad guys, the goons, the thugs that would burn down homes, burn down crops, steal the animals, goats, pigs, chickens. And if the men get involved in really nasty activities such as murdering young men and boys, raping the wives and daughters, that type of stuff, the more that went on in the South, the more people, you might say, turned away from the British and toward more of the colonial cause. And with the tactics of some of the British generals like Banastre Tarleton, who was really one of the nastiest guys in the Revolution, it's no surprise that many Southerners would turn toward the colonial cause. And people like Francis Marion, Thomas Pickens, Thomas Sumter in the South, and then Nathaniel Greene. These men were quite instrumental in helping to turn that tide, so that by the time we get toward the end of 1780, beginning of 1781, for all intents and purposes, the British have pretty much lost the South completely because the colonials, the people there in the South, felt that their interests would be better protected, not so much by the British anymore, but by the Continental Army, so that by 1781, the time was perfect, or you might say the time was right for all the colonies to unify behind Washington and the colonial cause. And so we get to the events of Yorktown in 1781. The British realized that they were losing ground rapidly, so they pinned their hopes, you might say, on one last-ditch effort to wipe out Washington, wipe out Lafayette and Rochambeau, finish them off once and for all in the epic battle in Yorktown by the end of 1781. But if anything, much like some of the other British generals, Cornwallis was outsmarted. And in this case, it was, you might say, a three-pronged effort. And with the French Navy led by Admiral de Grasse coming in at the right time, Cornwallis was pinned. He had no place to go. He was like the mouse caught in the corner by the cat. And for all intents and purposes, once Cornwallis surrendered, that ended everything. Even though the British still had a lot of manpower left, and they could have kept fighting, there was no more political will back in London and Parliament to continue on with the process. So for all intents and purposes, by then 1781, that was it. That was all she wrote, so to speak. And excuse me. That was all she wrote, for the speak. And now the American nation could finally begin to get itself going by the end of 1781. So yes. And then the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 to formally end all hostilities. Essentially, 1783 was when the nation was shall we say, finally an independent nation. But all in all, I mean, I think like I said, the point of all this was that even though it's great to promote these ideas like Jefferson did with the Declaration, which of course celebrating the 4th of July, it's one thing to do that, but then how to govern, that is how to consolidate, that is how to accomplish all your gains militarily. That took a long time, and then after that, even then things were much more confusing, much more chaotic as we get into the 1780s, and that of course is the bulk of what chapter 5 talks about. The nation went through a lot of problems, economically, politically, militarily, what to do about government. That is how much rights should be in the hands of the states, how much rights should be in the hands of the people, and how much rights should be in the hands of the federal government. So these are a lot of the issues that, of course, still had to be debated and decided after 1783. And to make a long story short, when the Articles of Confederation government, which of course is described quite a bit in chapter 4, when the Articles of Confederation government really couldn't address these issues of power and representation and governance, that of course is when we get the origins of the Constitutional Convention, which of course happened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. So delegates from all over the states now. Now we're switching from colonies to states now, and they're meeting in Philadelphia to discuss all of these issues. That is, what should the nation be? Should it be a democracy, or should it be more along the lines of the European nations, or should it be a mixture, a hybrid blend? I think for the most part, it was the latter that was accomplished. That is, the best way to govern this is to have, you might say, a hybrid blend of government, which in essence tries to find a balance between the power of the states, the power of the people, versus the power of the federal government. People like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison felt that one of the problems with governing a people is that people do things based on their emotions, their feelings, their sentiment. That is anger, lust, sadness, greed, sloth, envy. All of these things. These are things which drive people to do whatever they want to do. In other words, people are governed by their emotions. And with events which happen, such as the Shays Rebellion, which is described in much detail in the chapter. According to some of Washington's men who helped him during the revolutionary cause, if anything, some of the elites at the time, you might say, like Washington and his generation, they felt, oh my gosh, democracy has gone mad. People are just doing all kinds of crazy and nasty stuff. We don't want to see this stuff. We see this stuff maybe happening in Europe, but we don't want to see it happening here. So that's when you have people coming like Madison and more so Alexander Hamilton come on the scene and say, okay, here's what we do. We have to make government massive, extensive, power, because big government controls the passions of people. Yes, the people deserve a say-so in terms of how they're going to govern themselves. We have to give them that right. But we can't let democracy, we can't let too much democracy ruin the entire experiment. We can't let the majority of people impose their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own prejudices, whatever, over the minority of the people. This is the idea of what's called the tyranny of the majority. That is Madison was concerned that when government is in the hands of a majority faction of people, that is, let's say we're talking about people who are Protestant, more Puritan, and they come to power and into whatever position, and they say and they don't like the Catholics, and the Catholics in their state, whether let's say New York, they don't like what the Catholics are doing. They think the Catholics are this, they're that, and the governing faction says, well, we don't like the Catholics. We're going to impose laws so they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't run for office, they have to pay higher taxes, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's that type of stuff that Madison and Hamilton really feared, so that the idea is to make government powerful and expansive and wide-ranging, so that each segment of government counteracts the other. Madison believed this was what's called ambition counteracting ambition. If one branch of government, shall we say, gets too large or too massive, or it's governed by people who have all these wild and wacky thoughts, the other branch of government, you might say, could step in and tame that. That is the idea then of what we have with the separation of powers and checks and balances. Therefore, you make government divided by three main branches: executive, which is the president; legislative, which is Congress; and judicial, which eventually became the court system, the Supreme Court, the federal courts, the circuit courts, appeals courts. All the things that we hear about today. So that was the idea then of making government more powerful to, in essence, control the passions of people. Well, once the Constitution was finally announced in the fall of 1787, of course there were those in the States who thought, this Constitution stuff, this thing is massive, it's big, it's ugly, it's gigantic, it's ginormous. What's going to happen here? I thought we got rid of one king. Now this is going to give us a new king. We're going to get a new King George, or a King Philip, or a King Henry, whatever. This thing seems to be worse than the old stuff that we did. Much like the classic Who song, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." So that was the argument of people who felt that power was being taken away from them, taken away from the people, from the states, and put back in the hands of a big federal monster. These people became known as the Anti-Federalists, and among those who thought this new Constitution was kind of iffy was Thomas Jefferson, while those who supported the Constitution and put forth their ideas over a series of pamphlets were known as the Federalists, and that's where guys like Hamilton and Madison, John Jay, and many others came on the scene. They put forth their arguments over a series of pamphlets, and then each state had to accept or ratify the Constitution. That is, would they make this the law of the land, and would they agree to join a union of these states? But an interesting move. Madison believed that yes, it was still important to protect the rights of the people. Therefore, you add a Bill of Rights to the equation. That's where the Bill of Rights comes into. Of course, protect the rights of the people. That is vis-a-vis the power of a large federal structure, a large federal government. So, in other words, everybody, here's the gist of what's happening here. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are like a balancing act, in that they counteract each other. It's interesting that politicians today they talk about the Constitution, that is of the people, of this and that, but it's much more complex than that. If anything, the Constitution is a much more conservative document in that it provides the outline for a big, massive, powerful federal structure. I mean, if you read the Constitution in its entirety, you'll notice all the laws, all the mechanisms, all the processes by which a federal government is conducted. It's the Bill of Rights then, which in essence serves to counteract or counterbalance the excesses of federal government. And to this day, I think even though that structure might seem a little bit cumbersome, a little bit wild, I think the founding fathers recognized that because they seem to foresee that over the years the nation would change, the nation would develop as more people came in, new ideas, new technology. So they, you might say, deliberately made this structure so excessive, so powerful, so wide-ranging that there's room for interpretations to go along with the times. And nowhere is that spelled out, I think, a lot more in what's called the elastic clause in the elastic cause clause in Article 1, which talks about the idea of necessary and proper laws. That is, the federal government, Congress can do laws that is, in essence, in accordance to promote the will of the country. That is what's necessary and proper for the country. And this is the idea of what's called the idea of a strict loose constructionism, which people like Hamilton believed in, versus strict constructionism, which people like Jefferson believed, which of course is outlined in more detail in Chapter 5. I see I'm running a little bit ahead of time, so I'll just go ahead and bypass talking about Chapter 6 right now, but let me just quickly point out some of the the main themes of Chapter 6. Okay, Chapter 6, of course, gets into the ideas of the expansion of slavery, Southern slave experiences, white experience, and religion. So basically, Chapter 6 continues the process of explaining what's happening in the South as slavery begins to take root, not only as an economic institution, but as a political one and a social one too. And slavery, of course, does become the key issue, which causes the split between North and South leading up to Civil War. But slavery is also an issue which poisons other issues such as the notion of representation, over finances, that is over the diplomacy and so forth. So slavery in itself is an issue, but it also is an issue which poisons other issues. I think that's the best way to look at slavery, and when you're talking about what are the causes of the Civil War. And the other part of the program too was just a contrast of what's happening, that is, in the United States as the United States is forming. And let me just quickly get my my California program here, because at the same time that everyone is celebrating and just having a ball, so to speak, with the Declaration of Independence, over on the other side of the country, of course, things are taking on different shape here in California. The Spaniards are here. They're establishing the Spanish the mission system, starting in 1769 all the way through to the end of the 18th century. The Spaniards are still persisting with this missionary zeal, the Reconquista ethic I talked about in a previous video. They're going much more forward with, shall we say, a top-down approach of governing. So unlike the English colonies, now the new American nation, which is more of a mixture between power of the elite versus power of the people, balancing act between that. No, you don't see any of that. You don't see any of that stuff going on with the Spanish region here. Everything is still a top-down enterprise, and because the Spaniards still had a lot of fears of the European rivals, whether it was the French, whether it was the English, or in this case right here, whether it was mainly fear of the Russians, King Charles III, Carlos III, he for the most part pushes a really a top-down expedition, the Sacred Expedition, and then the point man being José de Galvez, who is mentioned in the PAR program. So here's where people like Father Serra, Captain Portola, Captain de Anza, and a host of many others, that is following the king's will and imposing order and structure over over the West Coast, over California. So in other words, while Boston and Philadelphia are getting rid of the king and say, you suck, king, go away, you're a bum and clown and a thug and a goon, but over in this side of the country, the royal power is still intact. It's still strong, and in this case, King Charles was the man of the hour as the mission system was being established, and of course with the pueblo and presidios, which were the towns and the forts, which were also part of this three-pronged expedition. Okay, anything else I need to mention here? No, all right, that pretty much does it. So I know we ran a little bit longer talking about Chapter 5 of the American Revolution, but I think that's those are some of the more important takeaways I wanted to present and discuss here, because of course, since it's the time right now going on with the holiday weekend, I think it was really imperative for me to at least discuss more about these issues and put the 4th of July into a wider context of the revolution. That is not just focusing in on July 4th, 1776, but what happens afterward. And then going into the 1780s, and of course the formation of the constitutional period. Okay, that's it, everyone. So 3 more of these videos to go, and then the session wraps up. So hope you guys are doing okay as we're at the halfway point of the of the session, and we'll do this again next week as we review chapters 7 and 8.